Hey guys, it's Luke. Just wanted to touch base with you. You'd asked some questions on the Facebook group, and so finally getting to those. Is the joy of the quarantine is being a homeschool teacher now. It kind of interrupts some things, so it takes a while, but we'll get to it. So anyway, we had I think 3 or 4 things to go over from the past week. Anthony had asked about he's used the Hanson's marathon method before, and he lives in Monument, Colorado at 7,100 feet. So he's basically no flat running, and he's at altitude. So he's wondering how she adjusts for tempos and long runs. And so the first thing is, part of it's going to depend on how hilly it is, right? So my version of being hilly might be different than your version of being hilly. Like, in Southeast Michigan, it's a little rolly, but it's probably not super hilly. Whereas somebody coming from a really flat area, say in the middle part of Michigan, it might actually seem very hilly. So part of that's going to be a factor in it. But I think your biggest thing you have to adjust for first is the altitude, right? And so that's not necessarily my best area of expertise. So I would find a calculator where you could adjust for altitude. 7,100 feet, you're definitely going to be feeling the effects of altitude. So you're definitely going to have an adjustment there. Regardless, your effort and paces aren't going to match up no matter what as far as that goes at altitude. So that'd be the baseline thing I do, is adjust your paces for whatever altitude you're at. And as far as the hilly part goes, and he's asking specifically about long runs and tempos. So tempos, I usually give people a range anyway. So if you have bought a plan from us in Final Surge and you input your goal time, it gives you a little bit of a range on tempos. And so that's a good place to try to keep in the range, depending on how much you have to adjust for altitude. So there's not really ever going to be a specific answer. That's going to adjust for a lot of people. But what I would say is, if you can periodically go down to flat. So like if you're at altitude and it's hilly, it'd be nice if you could go down, under 5,000 feet and try to do something on a flat area, so where you can actually match pace to effort. Then the very least you can match effort for the tempo runs. And so you can know what that effort is and the pace, and see what those adjusted paces are and see if that lines up. But that's going to be your hardest one. The hardest one is going to be for the tempos. For the long runs, as long as your effort is there, I wouldn't necessarily worry about where your pace is on those, unless you're trying to do something specific with like a fast finish or something like that. Because you have a pretty big range in those long runs anyway. And I think as long as you are, it's going to be very difficult to be on the fast end of that range. So I think as long as you're in the middle of that range, you're going to be fine. So the biggest thing I would say is adjust for where you're at on the tempo run. So that baseline, so again, just to recap, that baseline should be what those paces would be for the flat at altitude. And then you can go within that range that we provide for tempo runs. And so again, what I would do is maybe even go to, if you can't get all the way down to sea level, at least get under 5,000 feet on something relatively flat. Do a shorter tempo and just kind of match that pace and effort up. Take that back up to, if your regular runs are going to be, from your house or whatever, then you can kind of match those efforts, and then go down again. Say if you go down every 4 to 6 weeks and try to do a pretty good effort at a flatter area at under 5,000 feet, you're going to be able to keep continually line up those efforts and paces and make sure you're on the right path. So, that's one of those things where it's definitely going to be more effort than actually pace. And so you have to learn what that effort is going to be. So here's a situation where something like heart rate might be pretty good. I don't think I would necessarily be in continual monitoring of it during the run, but what I would do is kind of match those up after the run. Use that data. So like when you're flipping through your Garmin stats after the run, you take note of what that heart rate is and can kind of see what's happening over the course of the schedule, right? So early on, it's probably going to be higher, and then hopefully it just kind of gradually levels out or even gets a little bit lower as you become more adjusted to the efforts. But you can see if it's continually increasing and you're feeling worse, then we know that something's going on and you're probably hitting those a little bit too hard. So that's one of those things. And unfortunately, unless you're running the race in the same area, you really are going to have to learn what that effort feels like, so that when you do go down to sea level or flat or wherever you're going to be, that those efforts are going to line up. Because you might be, your effort is there, but your paces are way slower. at altitude and where you're at, and then you go down to sea level, and that same effort is all of a sudden significantly faster than what your goal marathon pace was, you can run into trouble really quick. So it is going to take some playing around. I think it's going to take some trial and error, and it's also going to try to take some efforts, like maybe 2 or 3 times during the course of the training, to try to get down and get into a situation where you can line up paces to effort and then take that back up to the altitude. So that's how I would approach it. But again, that's where the data and trends in that data is going to really, really help you. All right, so Stephen asked the difference between the 55 plan for Boston and the regular advanced plan. So as far as mileage, not a lot of difference. The advanced peaking out, say, is 60 to 65, and a lot of that just depends on how much you warm up and cool down. And so at the 55 level, I actually just have 1.5 mile warm-ups for each and everything. So if you go 2 or 3 miles for warm up and cool down, you're going to actually be into that 60 plus range. So from that standpoint, you're pretty much on the advanced plan. And that's how I originally set it up, but it was also going to be scaled back a little bit. Now, so figuring with Boston, nobody's necessarily a true beginner, so we can go up in the mileage a little bit. So it's more of a hybrid between, I guess would be like an intermediate and advanced, and maybe even a little bit beyond the advanced. So from that aspect, there's really no difference. There are some differences in workouts. Philosophy is the same, right? The philosophy is going to be the same. That's what's worked for everybody that's using these plans for the most part, unless you're brand new. And then, so there's no need to tinker with that philosophy. However, some of the workouts are different, but it's based on how we're approaching hills, right? So there's specific hill workouts, and then there's tempo runs where we're trying to get, kind of like what we talked about with Anthony, is we're trying to get effort over hills so we can kind of gauge that effort better at Boston and not necessarily be so reliant on the watch. So when we see a slow split, we don't panic because we know it was a pretty rolling mile. Or later in the race, you're not saying, oh my gosh, I was way too fast, I need to slow down, even though you were screaming downhill after heartbreak. So that's all we're trying to do, is we're trying to get you used to those situations and kind of use learning those efforts on those hillier routes so that you can take that with you to the specific race course. And in all honesty, the Boston schedules would work for any kind of rolling marathon course or even a net downhill course. Those would work fine for that. I know a lot of people who use the Boston plan and then just continue on to run Big Sur. I don't necessarily have a break in there because I don't even remember. It's like maybe a month difference between the two. So in reality, from Boston to Big Sur, it's really about picking which one you want to run really, really well. Usually people pick Boston and then just go to have fun at Big Sur, even though sometimes they end up running faster at Big Sur because there's no pressure on them. But ultimately, they train really hard for Boston and then just try to do their best to recover and get ready to run Big Sur. All that stuff that they did for Boston is still going to be in the system. It's not like it's gone away. So it's more about just getting your legs back underneath you at that point and moving forward from there. So hopefully that helps you. And then Janine, she asked about, looks like she's pretty new. She was recommended by a friend, and she wants to be in training for her second marathon in September. And I think the reason why I didn't answer her directly, just writing something out, was because I think a lot of people are in similar boats. I think that, so she's currently running 20 to 35 miles a week, which is a pretty solid base. She doesn't necessarily need to do much on that front. But I think what people think, in her case, she's already run a marathon. So she might be thinking, hey, I want to take that next step up to the advanced marathon. But when I'm reading what she's doing, she just, so for instance, she did a 12-mile run on a whim when she was planning 5 for 6 for the day. And she's self-describing herself as slower, and she wants to get faster and build the miles. So, but it sounds like might not necessarily be a lot of structure there. So she might in her head think, well, I've already done a marathon, I should just go up to the advanced. But the reality is, it's not really how many marathons you've done, it's really about what kind of training you've done. So if you've just run 20, 30 miles a week and ran a 5-hour marathon on that, then you don't necessarily need to do the advanced plan. That's probably going to be too much schedule for you. It's going to be too much intensity. What we really need to do is just kind of build those miles, introduce you to a structured training, introduce you to a disciplined plan, and that's really going to where you see the most benefit anyway. So a lot of people are in that boat. So in that case, if you've maybe run a marathon and you're like in between beginner and advanced, but you haven't really done you haven't run up to like 50, 55 miles a week, or you haven't done the workouts, the beginner plan is still going to work out really, really well for you. And then most people are going to do better off than that than trying to all of a sudden jump into the really hard schedule of the advanced. Because I think anybody who's done the plans know that these plans are not like a beginner. The beginner Hanson's marathon method is not what you would see in a true beginner plan that you'd see in like Runner's World or Hal Higdon or something like that. They're going to be significantly more difficult than that. But ultimately, Kevin and Keith want you to be prepared to run the best marathon you possibly can. But with that said, it means a lot of people can actually take a step back into that beginner plan and be really successful, because it's going to introduce you into workouts more slowly, and it's going to be a little bit better increase in the mileage for you. It's not going to just be a lot of intensity and a lot of mileage all at once, whereas the advanced plans already assume that you can train at a really high level, and it's just going to be a continuation of that. So for a lot of people, I would say take that step down to the beginner plan. It's not meaning you're any less in ability, but it's actually going to help promote your ability even more than just being overtrained with the advanced plan. So ultimately, that's what I think. And I think a lot of people would be in the same boat, where they would just really be more benefited by just doing the beginner plan. Just take the beginner part off of it. And that's ultimately what I've tried to do away with my own plans, is just say, it's really not whether you're a beginner or advanced. It's more about how many miles can you run a week, and what time frame do we have to get ready for the marathon, right? And that's really the two more variables than your experience. So your experience does play a part, but I think those other two factors are a little bit more when you're trying to get more specific with things. And you got to remember too that the beginner and advanced plans are trying to fit a big bell curve of people running a marathon, and so you really have to take that into account too. So again, I would say in your case, Janine, I would go into the beginner plan. And if you're in a similar spot like Janine, where you're fairly lower mileage, you've maybe run a marathon or two before, but you haven't really had a lot of structure, a lot of consistency, I would take the beginner plan, and that would actually set you up for better for success. So all right, so that's it for the questions this week. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Wherever you're seeing this video, if it's YouTube, just go in the comments. If you're in the Facebook group, definitely ask in there, and we will continue to do these. So, all right, guys, have a great weekend. I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.